Okay, Liz Mel. If you could just text her or let her know that this will be on YouTube if she misses the lesson, but hopefully that gets working again. But I'll mark her present. I know she wouldn't miss if she had a working internet. Okay, so today we're gonna now focus on the start of the civil rights movement, and we're gonna spend like the next few lessons looking at the civil rights movement. So while the Cold War is going on, the 1950s and 1960s also has a lot of movement towards civil rights, mostly for African Americans, but for other groups as well. We're going to start looking at how women start getting more rights, how we start focusing on the environment a little bit, how gays start to get some more rights. It's just a time where we start looking at all different groups of people and trying to help them out, and changing some of the laws that have been holding groups back. But understand, the Cold War does not stop. So even though we stopped talking about the Cold War for a little bit, the Cold War is still going on at this time. I often give I'll give the example, like, last year while COVID was going on, we also had like a big focus in our country with police brutality and the George Floyd incident. So it's like, both things can happen at the same time, and both things can be very important to a lot of people. And this is one of those things. So we have at this point the country going to some changes, not just in the Cold War, but also through the civil rights. Now, yesterday was a bridge lesson. So what that means is we kind of just talk about what happened prior to the civil rights movement, but after World War II in terms of the country domestically. So you should have seen things like the baby boom, ton of babies being born. You should have seen the suburbs be put into play. That's a very important new type of lifestyle that many people started to live. And cars in the highways. Okay, all those were very important. They will certainly be on your Unit 7 test. They're definitely stuff we need to know for the regions. I saw about 35 people did the lesson yesterday, about 20 didn't. So please, if you haven't done it, go back and do it. Again, I will hold true what I said, that I probably won't check until Friday to give people some time to complete it, but it is something that will be very helpful to do. All right, so just keep in the back of your mind, while the civil rights movement's going on, so was the Cold War. And while the Cold War is going on, so is the civil rights movement. All right. So let's first start with some things that actually happened prior to the start of the civil rights movement, because historians really say that the civil rights movement doesn't really start until Rosa Parks in 1954, 1955, 1956. But that doesn't mean that there's things that we have to there's definitely things that we have to cover before that. So today's actually some of the things that happened prior to the start of the civil rights movement that are important to civil rights, specifically for African Americans. So the way I do the civil rights movement is mostly focusing on the African Americans to start, and then we'll start going into some of the other groups of people a little bit later on. All right, but let's start looking at the biggest group the civil rights movement impacted, which is the African Americans. So let's start with this. This is known as the National Association for the Advancement of the Colored People, but you will never hear me call it that again because it's too long. We're just going to know it as the NAACP. All right, so let's take a look at what that is really briefly. This is one of the biggest things before Martin Luther King, before Rosa Parks, before the start of the civil rights movement. This was a big thing that kind of helped out specifically African Americans from like 1909 even to present day, but it was really big from like 1909 to 1949. So copy this down. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you guys in the chat. This is, review obviously, and it's something that we learned about in Unit 4 in the Progressive Era. There was W.E.B. Du Bois, he was one of them, and then there was another African-American individual that was pretty big in helping out African-Americans at the time in the Progressive Era. Does anyone remember what his name was? This is a review for the Regents exam. W.E.B. Du Bois, and this particular individual had a huge impact early on. Anisia is correct, Booker T. Washington. All right, though they disagreed on the path that African Americans should take to get more equality in the country, they were two very big individuals. W.E.B. Du Bois becomes a little bit more well known in terms of this class because of the NAACP. This is a big thing that he helped create, and they made a big push in stopping racial discrimination in the United States. So what are some things they do? Well, they're focused on just improving life for African Americans, okay, plain and simple. They want to improve and make sure education's going better, especially in the segregated areas and black communities. The housing's better, okay, the lifestyles, the houses that they live are better. And they're trying to improve some of the voting rights. Those, guys, don't forget the literacy test, the grandfather clauses, all those voting discrimination laws are still in effect, and it makes it very tough for black people to vote in this country, as we remember. So this group kind of went in and tried to help that. If there was a clear racist issue or a racist event that happened, the NAACP was a group that would kind of help out and try and fix that. So this is a group, I don't know where to fit in, okay, because they kind of come, their popularity really is during like World War I and the Roaring 20s. But this is the time that we kind of focus in on them now, and it's prior to the Civil Rights Movement. I heard someone say when I was in college that you wouldn't have a Martin Luther King without the NAACP. So this group, I think, had a profound impact, prior to the Civil Rights Movement. So this is a good group. Liz Mel, I don't know of any specific stories, but I'm sure that's exactly what happened. I would imagine this group in the KKK would not exactly get along too well. But I'm sure you could research and find some occurrences. I'm not aware of any off the top of my head. All right, so if you kind of remember that the NAACP has to do with helping out African Americans, it's pretty straightforward, a lot of the Regents' questions. So let's take a look here. The formation of the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. I've only seen the ADL once on the Regents. They were primarily a response to what? Okay, one is correct. Excellent. All right, they kind of throw abolition in there to maybe get you messed up with the timelines, but remember at this point, slavery's been finished in the United States for about 50 years by the time the NAACP gets created, so it's definitely not 3. All right, so they throw that there to kind of mess with you. All right, nothing to copy down here. These don't come up on the Regents, but I definitely need to mention these before we get into our main topic for today. So many people credit Rosa Parks' action as the start of the Civil Rights Movement in 1955. But in reality, it's kind of started long before that. We saw with the NAACP. Even though it's baseball and you guys would say, it's a sport, sports maybe aren't a big deal, this was a huge deal. When Jackie Robinson, okay, the black baseball player who broke the color barrier and became the first African-American to play professional sports since 1884, there used to be black baseball players in the mid-1800s when baseball kind of started. But as you know, Plessy versus Ferguson and segregation started to become a federal thing and not just a Jim Crow thing. So it used to be there wouldn't be black baseball players in the South, but if you went to Ohio, if you went to New York, you'd have black baseball players. The problem was when it became more of a federal and national issue, they got rid of black people in the major leagues, quote unquote, and they had 2 separate leagues, the major leagues and the Negro leagues. And Jackie Robinson was the first person to break the color barrier. And why that's important is, even though it's a sport, it's really the first time where a black person was integrated into a segregated place. Okay, because remember, no matter what the situation was, it could be a sport, it could be a school, it could be a hospital, it could be a bus, they were segregated. This was the first time, like, you could really say in American history that this was a major, major moment. And he dealt with a lot of crap, Jackie Robinson. He was a hell of a baseball player, but In the more important stuff, he, broke this color barrier and started to open the doors for Black people to become, athletes and, compete in the major leagues. And we obviously know the diversity in the sports leagues now in 2021. Okay. Not too long after that, President Truman, we've already talked about this, he integrated or desegregated the armed forces. So we know the Korean War was fought in a desegregated way. Whites and blacks fought together for the first war in American history. So that's obviously a positive thing. And the NAACP stated correctly, okay, because the whole idea was that Plessy versus Ferguson said what? Separate but equal. All right, and the argument was that the quality of the schools that kids were going to were not actually equal. And we knew that, okay? We see that looking back in history. So the NAACP really started to fight for desegregating schools, okay? So we started to have in the early 1950s, Black people start to argue that, hey, we're supposed to be separate but equal, but these schools aren't equal in quality whatsoever. And it started to lead to one of the biggest Supreme Court cases in American history. All right, so before we go into the Supreme Court case, I want you guys to work on the assignment posted. I'm gonna give you what I usually give you. I'll give you about 13 to 15 minutes. Okay, I would like for you guys to learn a little bit about the Supreme Court decision first before that we start talking about it. All right, you have a reading on Brown versus the Board of Education. You know you're gonna have your Supreme Court graphic organizer soon, but not this second. You're going to just do this, okay? You have 5 questions that go on it from the reading, and then you're going to answer the questions alongside with it here. Okay, obviously when you're done, class is not over. We still have a lot we need to get to, but you have those 5 questions you need to work on. All right, so get started with that. I'll give you, take a look at your time. I'll give you to 9:40 on the dot, 9:40 on the dot, and then we're coming back together. If you finish early, you could just relax on work on the practice regions, which is going to be due on Thursday. All right, I'll shut up so you guys can focus. Evidence meaning, quotes from the text. I don't need it. If you can answer the question with, good reasoning without using evidence from the text, that's fine. Or you can use evidence. Either is fine. As long as you put a coherent answer together, we're never going to be upset. Halfway through, about 7 minutes left. Okay, just about 2 minutes left. Okay, that is the famous cue. Please go to the classwork and scroll down to the Supreme Court graphic organizer. Let's put the next one up. I usually rip on the Supreme Court for some bad decisions. This was not one of them. This was a good decision, I think. So let's go into this Supreme Court decision. It's a very famous one, definitely in the top 10, maybe even the top 5 Supreme Court cases to know for the regions. And that is Brown versus the Board of Education. So you guys just did a reading on this, so what I'm going to explain right now shouldn't be too crazy. Thurgood Marshall, who is a very famous lawyer at the time, who eventually became a black Supreme Court justice, but that's for a different day. But he's a very famous lawyer at the time. He argued that the schools cannot be separate because the black schools were so much worse than the white schools in terms of quality. Marshall said that Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 violated the 14th Amendment. Okay, so you need to guys to go back to think what that 14th Amendment is. The 14th Amendment talked about how basically, okay, the very basic stuff is that African Americans have the right to be citizens, but basically all minority groups have equal protection under the law. Okay, and eventually Brown versus Board of Education is going to overrule and overturn Plessy versus Ferguson and say that courts ruled that segregation in schools was illegal and that all schools needed to be desegregated. It essentially overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that separate but equal and Jim Crow laws was okay. Now, I want to make this clear. This does not end segregation in the country. This does not end segregation in all parts, but it does end segregation in schools. Okay, it does end segregation in schools. So in your Supreme Court cases graphic organizer, you need to copy down what's in yellow if you didn't gather that already. Okay, if someone has it and wants to write it in the chat, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much, you guys. Here's the thing, and I don't know if the reading went into it. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but can you explain the one big problem after the Supreme Court case? And it has to do with time. The Supreme Court case was good. Go ahead, Aura.
So the problem after this was that they never specifically said when the schools had to be desegregated because they didn't want to anger the southern states. So integration took a while because they never said like immediately. So they took their time with that.
It didn't say by the first day in 1956. It didn't say by 1960. It just said it. So this becomes a tricky situation now because, you know, states that were okay with integration did it right away without much of a problem. States, specifically in the South, that were not as okay with this, they took their sweet old time. And some of them took like 10, 15 years to do. But I gotta say, I think the president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we haven't really met too much yet, just a little bit, he does some things that really help out integration going a little bit faster. And I'll show you what this is. This is a very famous situation you're about to look at. I'm sure you guys are actually, most of you already familiar with it. We'll do those later. Yep, well, yeah, the public school system, yep, good point, Anicia. Yeah, people would start to go to Catholic schools or private schools if they didn't want to be a part of the integration process. Very good point. All right, let's take a look at how desegregation and the Little Rock Nine, that's the more famous group. So Little Rock, for those that don't know, is in the state of Arkansas, which is a southern state, you know, used to be a part of the Confederacy, and they weren't so thrilled with the integration process, okay, because, you know, of their former, you know, ties to slavery and the Jim Crow laws. They weren't so happy about this. So many states tried to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling on desegregation, okay, but this is a friendly reminder that we learned about in Unit 1, the Supremacy Clause, okay? It states that any law the federal government passes or any decision the Supreme Court makes, the states must follow. All right, so this becoming a Supreme Court decision, this is something that everyone needs to follow. Okay, one of the negatives with Plessy versus Ferguson is that it became a mandated thing to have segregation in the country. Okay, but it works both ways now. Now that Brown versus Board of Education's come into play, the Supreme Court has basically ruled schools need to desegregate. All right, and there's a very famous occurrence, and there's many others. Okay, Ruby Bridges is another great story. Not Ruby Bridges, sorry. Thought I hit the S. Ruby Bridges is a great story. Maybe in PS 89 you have learned her story a little bit about a young girl, okay, going through the integration process, a young child, you know, no more than 8 years old. That's a great story. But for the Regents, the big one is the Little Rock Nine. So we're going to focus mostly on this one. It said that 8 of the little... Oh, yeah, Liz Mel. Yeah. It's not too long ago. You know, it's 1950s. You know, my father and mother were born in 1951. So, yeah, it's not too long ago, that's for sure. I think a lot of people were still around, for sure. Okay, and for those that don't know the story, I'll oversimplify it a little bit, but basically there were 9 African-American teenagers. They became enrolled in an all-white school in Arkansas, okay, so they're the first 9 students. Why this, was this the only time this happened? No, but this became a national story for a couple of reasons. Number one, the district and the mayor of the city basically came out and said they would not allow the black students to enter. So if they approached the school, okay, if they approached the school, they were not going to be allowed to enter and the police would be there to arrest them, sort of thing. So this is one of those situations where a state and a city, this is federalism, right? A state and a city is basically not allowing what the federal government wants. Okay, so this is where Dwight D. Eisenhower really makes his mark in terms of the civil rights movement. So the president's main job in our country is to enforce the laws and enforce Supreme Court decisions. So he decides, okay, if that's what they're going to do, we're going to bring in our National Guard, we're going to bring in our military, and we're going to escort the young students, okay, into the school. And if the school has a problem with it, we will meet them with force. It's a very tense moment. Okay, the president is basically saying that he will use military force if he needs to allow the students to enter the school. Okay, and this is a great time where he's going to use his power as commander-in-chief. Yes, Sydney, go ahead. Sydney, question? Anyone here, Sydney? Or was that an, oh, it's an accent. Oh, okay, no problem. So he uses military power as commander-in-chief by sending the military to forcibly allow students to enter a school. There's two very famous photos I'm about to show you. I think you'll be familiar with them. One is a kind of distasteful photo, but kind of inspirational too. And the other one is just a cool photo. I think it's an important photo, and it's one of the first times where the federal government stands behind African Americans, okay, maybe since, you know, Civil War, okay, and the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think it's a pretty cool moment here. So I'll show you that coming up now. I am kind of stalling though, because I figure some people are still copying. If you guys could be so kind again to put that into the chat, that would be very helpful. Or take a picture of the notes, that helps too. I'm in no rush. I want to do the Regents questions. We're just going to do them a little bit differently today. The video will be uploaded to YouTube by 10:15, maybe 10:30. All right. Want to move on. I want to show you these photos really quick. Thank you, Lena. Okay. This is a very famous photo of one of the Little Rock 9 students walking. You can kind of see the military, the National Guard in the back. That's you have a better photo of this a little bit, but this is obviously the famous photo, if you haven't seen it before, of the young African-American woman walking into the school, and she's kind of being yelled at and berated a little bit. No violence, but, you know, obviously verbal abuse, you know, took place, as you kind of tell, the yelling, the screaming. So that is obviously a very famous photo. A little bit earlier on, okay, you also have this famous photo, which is the military escorting the troops, escorting the young women and men into the school, into Arkansas. And obviously, once the military showed up, the police stood down, and the mayor stood down and actually had to apologize for what he tried to do and going against the federal government's wishes. So this is prior to the civil rights movement, technically, but this was obviously a big step in terms of African-American equality because of the desegregating of the schools. Okay, there are 5 Regents questions. We'll do a little bit differently. This is not a quiz. This is just a quick way for me to evaluate your guys' stuff. So you guys can do that. Click on the Google form. There are 5 questions that go with it. You guys will leave at 9:54, but we'll see how much we get done and if I can kind of get a sense of if you guys are good or if I have to clarify some things. But these are all relating to the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling and the desegregation of schools. So there's 5 questions. See how you guys do. You'll see a chronology question. You'll see some amendment questions. It's a good mix of review and what's going on currently in the civil rights movement. Certainly a good start because 6 people have turned it in. Not one person's got a question wrong yet, so that's a good feeling. Let's keep them coming. All right, well, it is 9:54, so I'll see the answers kind of roll in. They look good so far. Most of you guys are getting a good job. They will be corrected. The answer will be given. If you have any questions, you can let me know. So then we'll kind of get into the technical start of the civil rights movement tomorrow, which is going to starting with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and some of those important topics there. All right, I will see you all tomorrow. I'll see you 6th period. Have a great rest of your day, guys. Bye-bye.